name is Gideon, your host as always. Welcome to A Fact of Life. I'm also the host of Africa Chat. You can find Africa Chat and Fact of Life podcast on all platforms, all social medias as well. And today I'm really excited. I do have a doctor here. We're back to have a really nice and interesting conversation. Dr. Padda, welcome to Africa Chat and Fact of Life.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So how are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent.
That is great. So I wanted to ask, can you explain how pain and addiction are in a connection? What does it say about our understanding of chronic diseases overall?
Well, you've asked a gigantic question. So I'm going to break it apart because I think that that's the important way to look at this. There's a couple things. Gideon, you're from West Africa. The rate of diabetes in West Africa and the rate of obesity in West Africa is pretty low. There are people in West Africa and in Central Africa that their major malnutrition is the malnutrition of not enough food, not enough protein, and not enough and that's their major issue. And that was the major issue in the United States for a long period of time. However, in the 1970s, 1980s, we started to rapidly increase our body mass. And instead of having the malnutrition of not enough food, we have the malnutrition of X. We've been given way too much nutrition. And we're getting so much nutrition to the point where we are getting more and more obese. And the obesity leads to insulin resistance. I'm going to give this to you from a physiologic standpoint. When your body thinks it's going to consume sugar, it thinks that it's going to get some sugar, it releases a hormone from your pancreas called insulin. And insulin drives the sugar into the cells. And initially, that sugar is consumed by the cell as energy. But if there's too much sugar in the cell, it doesn't know what to do with it. It overflows, it tries to store it, and if it can't store it in a conventional way like glycogen, which is a storage for sugar, it will then overflow and store as fat. All the while, every time you eat something sweet or you think you're going to eat something sweet, you dump insulin. So insulin is a fat storage hormone. It causes, eventually, fat storage. Historically, people would move a lot and they would do a lot of activity. And so they didn't really store up glycogen as a reserve area. But because we don't move anymore and we're sedentary, we don't really consume our glycogen. And we're always at the brim full of glycogen. So every time we eat sugar, it overflows to fat right away. That's why we constantly get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's part of the story. That's not the whole story, though. There's another part, and that is that there are chemical compounds that we're being exposed to since the 1970s, which very inflammatory. And these chemical compounds affect our cells in such a way that it changes the receptors on the surface of the cells. The insulin receptors live on something called a lipid raft, and these are on the surface of the cell. Well, vegetable oils interact with that lipid raft and destroy the receptor's ability to perceive the insulin. So we're producing a bunch of insulin and it's working, but then eventually our cells are unable to even see the insulin and we produce even more insulin. So that's interesting. Now we keep pumping out more and more insulin and the cells can't really see it completely. And yet it's a fat storage hormone. Insulin also happens to be a growth hormone. So it makes you grow. Well, if you're an adult, you're probably not going to grow taller. You're going to grow wider. And so the more insulin you have, the wider you get as an adult. And if you look at type 1 diabetics who have an absence of insulin, type 1 diabetics, by definition, don't produce insulin. They're really skinny. It's only when you start giving the type 1 diabetic insulin do they get fat. And that's the problem. They become obese because they store fat and they start to get wider. So that's an issue. Now, you've got the issue with the vegetable oil. You've got the issue with the sugars. All the while you increase this fat storage, the fat itself releases hormones. One of them is called leptin. Leptin is the thing that goes to your brain and says, hey, I'm full. Stop eating. My fat cells are full. Stop eating. Well, what happens is the brain quickly habituates and it desensitizes to an elevated level of leptin. If you constantly give somebody a high dose of a neurotransmitter, their brain no longer sees that neurotransmitter. And so it stops responding to the leptin. So the fat cell starts producing more leptin. And then the brain stops responding. The fat cell produces even more leptin. The brain stops responding. Now, all the while this is going on, leptin has a second function. The second function of leptin is that it's a potent inflammatory cytokine. In fact, it's one of the most potent cytokines that we have, which triggers severe inflammation in our body. And so now you're in a state of hyperleptin as you gain fat mass because you're producing so much leptin because it's directly proportional to your fat mass. And yet the leptin is not just telling your body to stop eating, it's also telling your body, I'm under attack and I have an immune response. And that's why we're seeing this rampant pain issue. So that kind of tells you, it backs into why is it that obese people and patients that are diabetic type 2 have severe pain issues? Because they're hyperleptin. Now, there's another factor. The vegetable oil does something else. As we consume the vegetable oil, it converts into a compound that goes to your brain and turns off your ability to sense oxytocin, and your oxytocin production goes down. Oxytocin is the love hormone. It's the bonding hormone between a mother and a child. It's the bonding hormone between people. And if you deplete somebody of oxytocin, they start to get depressed and they stop bonding with people. They start to self-isolate. And the more vegetable oil you consume, the more self-isolated you get. And that's why we're sitting here in front of a computer talking to each other thousands of miles apart, because we no longer interact with people directly, because our oxytocin levels are depleted and we no longer have that bonding capacity. And this really affects loneliness, and loneliness directly drives addiction. Addiction is a disease of loneliness more than it is a disease of exposure to drug. And so all of these things are interrelated. I'm not saying that they're absolute. I'm not saying, oh, if you eat sugar and you eat vegetable oil, you're going to become addicted. But I'm saying the preponderance goes up. Now, at the same time, we've destroyed our food supply, and our microplastics are rampantly increasing in our food supply, not just ours, but in all of the animals around us, because they eat what we eat, and they're exposed to the microplastics that we produce, such to the point that we're starting to see long-term environmental chemical disruptors that disrupt hormone production in almost every animal that we have. And that's why we're starting to see gender dysphoria. People can't really figure out if they're a boy or girl. The rate of gender dysphoria historically has been about 1.8 to 5.8%. But with the Gen Z population, that rate is hitting 20.8%. And that's a study done by Boucher. It's 20.8%. 1 out of 5 kids has gender dysphoria. And how do we know what it's from? You can measure the microplastics in the amniotic fluid, and you can see that they're dramatically increased. You can see the microplastics in frog population, and the frogs start to become hermaphrodites. You can see something called the anogenital distance, and they've actually done studies even on polar bears. The shorter the anogenital distance, the more hermaphroditic the animal is. The polar bears are starting to get this. The reason why is that they're apex predators, and they eat the seals, who eat the fish, who eat the plankton,
and then a cycle
who are
goes
consuming the microplastics in the ocean. And we can measure the microplastic in the polar bear. And genetically, they're shifting over time. And so at the same time as this goes on, sperm production is going down. And we're at the point in the United States where our reproductive rate is so low that but for immigration, our country is dead. We would have, but for immigration coming in, we are not at a replacement value. We're not producing enough humans in the United States to replace the people that we have. There are other countries like China and Japan that are actually in negative growth territory, and that's what's crashing their economies. And so for me, I float between the world of medicine and business. So I love talking about both ends of this. But all of these things are interrelated, and all of them are nutritional basis issues.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Padda. This is actually really interesting. If I should be honest, I've never really looked at it from that massive point of view at all. I do know a little bit about some of the things you just mentioned about, but I never know that I knew that it was a whole cycle that was going on that is affecting the entire population and the entire environment as well. Now, one of the favorite things that I have personally read and actually heard you say and talk about is health and wealth. So tell me, doctor, how do health and wealth intertwine in your own point of view? Let's just talk about that.
Yeah, if you're not healthy, you don't have anything. I don't care how wealthy you are. If you don't have health, you will give every nickel, dime, and penny to get your health back. So I don't care how wealthy you are, but without the health, it's of no value. You're not going to live
True.
1 second and you can't enjoy it. And so that's issue one. You have to have a fundamental basis of health. The other thing is people look at people that work out and that have muscle mass and they go, well, that's a muscle head. Well, you got to realize that there's something called brain derived neurotrophic growth factor, BDNF. It occurs when you use your muscles. BDNF is produced when you use your muscles and you start having activity, which makes you skinnier, makes you more muscular, and makes you a lot smarter because you need the BDNF to increase your nerve growth factors in your brain. And that allows the interaction of one neuron to another. It allows you to recover from injury and it allows you to have all kinds of other factors. But being healthy, you don't sleep well. Without sleep, you don't function. And so these things are all interrelated. You cannot have one without the other. And you can certainly be healthy and not have a lot of money, but you cannot be wealthy and be okay with it if you have no health. And the healthier you are, the more likely you are to make a lot of money, and to be able to help your community. Those are some of the underlying issues. I work with large numbers of groups of people that historically they've been sidelined. I've worked in tribal nations. I've worked in the U.S. in tribal nations. I've worked with groups of people that are Aborigines off the north coast of Australia. I've lived with people there. Now, there's a guy named Weston A. Price. He did an amazing study. And what he did is he went around the world and he looked at people's jaws. And if you look at your jaw, you have a big mouth. That tells me that your mother had excellent nutrition when she was growing up. Before she had you, she had excellent nutrition. The nutritional status of the mother determines the jaw width of the child, which then determines their IQ. And if you have a poor IQ, it's unlikely that you're going to be wealthy. So there's another interaction. When I was dealing with people in Papua New Guinea, and when I'm dealing with people in the north coast of Australia off of Palm Island, and when I'm in tribal nations, they have giant mouths. Even though they're not getting Western food, and even though they're not using currency, but in their minds, they're wealthy. They have need for nothing.
Wow.
And it's only when they move to the cities and you look at those populations where the jaw size gets smaller and smaller and smaller, you'll notice that they start to thin out their jaws, their mouths get smaller. Those people are not healthy and they have tremendous needs. They have tremendous desires and they don't feel complete. They have a hunger for there's got to be something else out there. And so I think that there's a strong connection between that health status and your desire. So wealth is not the concept of I have 5 million or $10 million or 50 million. Wealth is the concept of satisfaction. And it's the concept of I feel complete. So it's not a dollar number. It's more of a function of do you feel comfortable and complete? And it's not, wealth is not financial. It's spiritual. It's religious. It's your ability to interact with nature. It's your ability to do the things that you want to do and to think the way that you want to think and to be able to participate in society and to have something meaningful. There are people that don't have much money, but they feel very wealthy. And they're probably wealthier than some of our extremely rich people in the United States who have this terrible hole in their hearts and hole in their brain. They don't know what to do. So that's kind of how I approach that issue.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doc. It makes a lot of sense to be honest. Definitely I saw this and both of the videos I did see online, I think I seen both on Twitter. They were from should I say quote unquote rich Africans. And one of them was saying that people or younger generation basically that he was pointing at that stays in the gym all day, all night, should go out there and get money and work hard and do stuff like that. But then he emphasized the fact that if you have a pot belly, if you don't have a six pack, that's a point proving that you're actually working hard. I scratched my head a little bit when he said that. And then he went further to say that building muscles, gaining all the six packs doesn't make you rich, which in a way I understand. But your point, what you just said, actually made me more happier because now I understand how wrong he was. Like you said, and another friend, another video, another African guy said this too. He said that while most skinnier or most people that are physically working out and actually active are much smarter. It was a podcast, and the whole internet broke that day when that video came out. And then you just kind of read right now what you just said. The more so, doctor, are you saying that I want to understand this? The more weight you lose, the much smarter you become. Is that something that we could say as a good variable, or I'm getting the
Well,
whole thing wrong?
so there's two factors here. We know that individuals who are obese, chronically obese, have neuroinflammation. We know that if they're insulin resistant and they have high cytokines, they have neuroinflammation in their brain. We also know that there's a decent IQ the more obese you are. And there's multiple factors for that. One is certainly that you don't have neurons that are impacted as much as they should be, and they're not firing at the same rates as other people's neurons. And we also know that you have a shrinkage of your hippocampus, which is your short-term memory. So you don't maintain short-term memory. So more overweight, you have nerve damage. And we also know that the more you exercise to a point, the more BDNF you have and the more protrophic, pro growth status you have in your brain cells. And the more likely you are to have a bigger hippocampus, the more likely you are to have a better kinesthetic sense of life, and the less likely you are to have visceral obesity. Obesity is that pot belly. And it also tells me likely that you have a pretty good diet. See, you can't out exercise a bad diet. If you have a bad diet and
Well,
you have a bunch of
that's a
sugar
good
and
quote.
vegetable oil,
Mm.
you cannot outrun that with exercise. But people that look healthy typically are not just exercising, they have a good diet. And that's the critical element. It's not just exercising and eat crap food anyway. It's not going to help you because you're not going to be able to do it, and it's not going to improve your nerve function in your brain. So it's more than just simply exercise. It's also the dietary, which is what makes people look fit. And that's what, that's what I want to get people back to. We didn't, if you go back 45 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, and you looked at beach pictures, people were skinny. You look at those same beaches right now, and people are 40 pounds overweight. And there's a statistic that by 2035, 99% of African American female patients that are adults will be overweight or obese. Half of them will be diabetic, and 2/3 of them will go on to renal failure. That's
Wow.
gigantic. That's huge.
Yeah, that's
And
huge.
that African American obesity rates 55 years ago, 50 years ago, were less than 10%. And now they're going to be 99% in 2035. I mean, that's a sea change. That's not just a little thing that's happened. Now, I know that there's drugs out there that people are talking about. Oh, you can take Ozempic, you can do this, you can do that. Using these medications, Ozempic has its downsides. It stops you from eating. And what ends up happening is you end up losing weight, but you lose muscle first. And when you come off the Ozempic, which is pretty expensive, and you start to eat again,
You
you
go right back
regain
to it.
your weight, but you don't regain your muscle. And so you regain fat, but not muscle. because it takes exercise to regain muscle. And when you regain fat without muscle, you actually are much worse off. And sarcopenic wasting, which is the loss of muscle, is strongly correlated with early decline. It's correlated with a decline in your health span. It's correlated with a decline such to the point that you have increased falls, you have increased nerve loss, you have increased cognitive decline. So those are the factors that I worry about. So just being skinny is not it. It's a combination of weighing less and having more muscle and having good nutrition. Those are the
Dr.
factors that I look at.
Dr. Padda, I have a follow-up. So do you think we are looking at body positivity wrongly of late? Because I asked this, I'm just my overall question is what I just asked you, but I'm asking this question based on the fact that there are movements and there are hashtags for body positivity going on, and most of the time, what I've realized is it's actually geared towards encouraging people to be whatever they want to be, and in that terms, no matter how big you are, no matter how skinny you are, just be it. It doesn't matter. You should be whatever you want. Do you think we're preaching it right?
I don't think that I can tell somebody else what to do. I can only bring them the information. You can always be too skinny. You can always be too fat. You can always, have factors that are bizarre. But I know from a health standpoint, there is a range and parameter. And so I don't look at weight alone. I don't say, oh, that person is overweight. What I look at is their underlying blood testing. I look at specific tests that tell me what their metabolic status is. So I'm not looking at necessarily, oh, that person's overweight. Certainly I might recognize that, and that might trigger me to ask the next question. Hey, what can I do to help? Or what do we need to do? But it's really the blood tests. It's the underlying physiology that I'm more interested in. If your LPIR is high, if your gamma glutamyl transferase is high, if your GGT is high, if you have a fatty liver, if you have those underlying metrics plus others, then that's not a healthy status, and we got to fix that. So I ignore the body positivity movement because I think that that's all fluff. I think that and I think that that's basing somebody's decision on the way somebody looks. I think that's the ultimate form of discrimination. By saying I'm going to ignore how somebody looks, that's also discrimination. And so my feeling is we use concrete tools to help determine, is this an appropriate health status? And then we use the physiology of how do we help this person? And beyond that, how they want to choose to dress, how they want to look, that's up to them. But we can certainly have generalizations. There's a lot of people that I've met that are very skinny, and they have the worst sarcopenic wasting you've ever seen. And they have a fatty liver. Especially in the Asian community, you'll see very skinny Asians, and they're incredibly insulin resistant, and they're having severe neuroinflammation, but yet they're skinny. And those are issues. That's one of the major issues in China right now, because they use something called sewer oil. They use recycled vegetable oil that comes out of the sewer that basically is a trans fat, and they're reusing it over and over and over again. And that trans fat causes liver damage. It causes damage to the cells. It causes damage to the brain. That's incredibly unhealthy because end result is that it increases the risk of severe vascular disease. It increases the risk of cognitive decline. It increases the risk of stroke. Those are the things that I worry about. So I don't, and I've been asked that question many a time about the body positivity movement. I don't think that's the right question. I think the question is, what's the underlying status? There are big people that I've met that are very, very healthy. And there are little people that I've met that are very skinny, that are very, very unhealthy. So that's not the issue. It's the underlying
I
issues
do have a
more
friend
about.
that lives in Germany. Him and I standing side by side. You may think I'm bigger. I'm not healthy. I'll tell you one of the things he does. He goes to work. He comes home. He eats a big amount of meal, watches Netflix, goes right to sleep. On the other hand, I go to work. I wake up at 5 in the morning, sometimes 4. Go to work, come back, relax a little, eat. I time the way I eat. I don't eat after 7 p.m. I rest a little, maybe 2, 3 hours, wake up, go to the gym, do a little bit of exercise as much as I can because I'm already tired from the day. Come back to sleep. I repeat. That's what I just told you. Between me and him for years and years now, he is always skinny. I'm always bigger than him. So whenever I talk to him, he's like, "Well, I'm skinny. Why do I need to worry about this?" I'm like, "The way you're eating, the type of food you eat, the way you're living your life. You may not be skinny, but you may be sick." And then he just laughs it out. But so you're right. You can't really. I asked that question and I was expecting that answer that you just gave, and you even gave more explanation to it that makes much more sense than I even expected to hear. You can't really look at someone and tell exactly how healthy they are. It's a wrong concept. I think it's just the society and how it became. And over time, I mean, in the past, just like you said, the way people look could, I'm afraid to say, may have been able to be used to determine how healthy they are. But things have changed. I don't know if I'm wrong on that. You can correct me on that, Dr. Padda, but I think that's what is going on. You can't physically tell how people are doing anymore, health wise, currently than it used to be. And
Yeah, you,
so,
you can't.
mhm.
And there's so much. The other factor is there's a lot of endocrine disruptors in our food. I would make a suggestion to you, Gideon. One of the critical elements that people ignore when they exercise, is one of the most critical elements that's ignored is that it is the amount of stress that you place on your exercise load. So it is not about spending a lot of time exercising. People have this perception that, oh, I got to spend 45 minutes to an hour and I got to do it 7 days a week or 5 days a week. So that's one factor. It's not time dependent per se. It's not like, oh, you got to spend 45 minutes and you got to do this number of sets of this. Weightlifting is certainly more valuable as we get older than is aerobic exercise. But really, it's one of the bigger functions is to create a sufficient force of stress that uses your entire body and pushes you to the point where you're pulling the fat out of your liver and you're creating a deficit of significance. And so, what that means is an all out, full out 20 to 25-second exercise burst. And if you do that just 2 or 3 times a week with good rest between and only 2 or 3 episodes of that per exercise, you will lose more weight and you will become healthier than you would spending 45 minutes in the gym 7 days a week.
Right.
So what I typically do, and we've, as human beings, we were used to running extremely fast for very short distances to go catch that rabbit, to go hunt that thing, or to run away from the tiger. And so what I do is I do something called a shriek and run, which is my own word for it. And I get on a self-propelled treadmill. So it's a treadmill that has no electricity in it. And I get
Oh,
on that
wow.
thing and I run as fast as I can for 20 to 24 seconds. And it takes me 3.5 to 4 minutes to recover. I'll do 3 sets of those, and that's it. So that's about a minute and a half of exercise or less with 20 minutes of recovery. And then certainly I'll work some other muscle groups and do things like that because I want to maintain muscle mass. But that all out run for 2.5 minutes, for 20 seconds, is sufficient to maintain my muscle mass and sufficient to increase my growth hormone and allows me to recover. The other thing that people don't do that it really has a huge benefit is the use of sauna. We have this thing called heat shock protein 9, HSP9. If you use a sauna after you work out, especially at the end of the day, it heats up your skin, but it cools your core. And the heat shock protein makes you think you're about to die. It's an hormetic response. Same thing with the running. It's a hormetic response. Your body thinks it's about to die because you're being chased by a tiger. So it dumps testosterone and growth hormone, mobilizing all the fat stores. The heat shock protein also does the same thing. So 20 to 25 minutes in a heated sauna will do more for me than exercise will. So I do very little exercise and as in terms of total time under tension, but I do these other things that dramatically improve the outcome. And all of these things lead to very high BDNF, very high growth factors for my brain. And that's what allows me to think. And then, nutrition is even more important than the exercise. So you got to make sure that you have adequate and appropriate nutrition. And so that's what I focus in on is that nutrition, and then very high burst exercise for short periods of time. And that's what I have my patients do. It works amazingly well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pat, for that information. I will be looking much into it because for the simple fact that I'm looking to live healthy as well and actually lose a little bit of weight. Historically, my natural weight was around somewhere 160, 170. Now I'm weighing 200 pounds, and I would like to go back down to it because that's when I started snoring. That's when I started feeling more tired, doing just less work. So you're right about all the things, and I've been working on it, especially since last year. I did end up doing the surgery, like I mentioned earlier. For basically, I did have an obstructed, I think, nasal. So it was basically to open it up. I was down for a while, and when I was ready to go back, I have been back, and I did lose. Was prior to that, I weighed 220 pounds, so I did lose some. I'm still working on it. But I will add what you just said because I've actually read somewhere about what lifting weight does help. But I did realize I lost more weight by just basically going back to managing the way I eat and the type of exercises I did. Sometimes in the gym, there are certain equipment I probably will never end up touching because it won't do what, like you just mentioned, what it's supposed to be doing for my body or what I'm looking for. So that is something to consider. Now let's move a little bit off topic and also wrapping up here. You did mention about the economy moving from a certain dark forces. Can you describe what these forces are and how they affect everyday life?
Yeah, so it's not so much as dark forces as it is a combination of just bad stuff that happens inadvertently. It's a combination of factors. So let's talk a little bit about inadvertent things that happen. It's called the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings in Japan, and yet we have a tsunami that happens all the way in the United States. And you can track it back to the butterfly flapping its wing, but it's not directly related, but it's because of that it happens. So there's things that happen that we have unintended consequences. And what's happened is that our diet and our food and how we interact and our intelligence, our economic status, all of these things are interlinked in a very complex adaptive system. There are probably 5,000 to 6,000 different inputs that determine what we weigh. There's tens of thousands of inputs that determine our intelligence. The wealth of nations is determined by the sum of its output. And what's happened is, as we have deteriorated our physical health, we've decreased our physical output. And as we've decreased our physical output and our cognitive capacity, we have a problem. We haven't sent anybody back to the moon since when? I mean, we did a moonshot in the United States. We put people on the moon, and we still have problems getting satellites in the air. And we haven't sent anybody back to the moon. Why not? It's because we have deteriorated as a global entity. We're relying more and more on artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is very interesting. It's a large language learning model. It's an LLM. And we have super brilliant people that are headlining that. But the people that are consuming it don't understand how it works. They think it's a magic box. It's the equivalent of bringing a lighter to a caveman and flicking it twice and it popping up with light. Are people no longer connected to the underlying technology, and they don't even understand how it works? And they look at computers as some magical creatures that have an independent life. No, they're just computers. It's computer code. It's sequencing of information. But we've lost touch with that information. And what's happening is we've dumbed down our educational basis. And as we do that, not just in the US, but all over the world, we're making people less and less intelligent. And as we do that, it destroys our economy. Underneath all this, there are people that are recognizing it. There's groups of people that recognize it. and they try to make difference for themselves because they're self-motivated, and they watch what happens, and they observe and they make differences. That's what a good stock trader does. They look at things that are going on in their environment and try to figure out, how am I going to capitalize on this? That's why when there was a housing crisis and Michael Burry looked around 20 years ago and said, this housing crisis from 2008, this housing crisis is going to destroy the US fabric. He bet against it. He's super
Yeah.
smart. He spent a lot of time thinking about it, whereas the rest of the people didn't. So there's always going to be people with intelligence in specific field that have asymmetrical knowledge because they know something. And I think that from a business standpoint, if you are a specialist, if you have asymmetrical knowledge of outcome, you're going to do a lot better. And that's one of my companies is called Red Pill Capital. And we do asymmetric investments. We look at troubled zones in the world and we predict what negative things are going to happen. And then based upon that, we place financial bets to make money. We buy into areas that people are leaving. I used to run a company called Tribal Link, and Tribal Link would buy household artifacts from people that they were going to throw out. They didn't want them anymore, but I knew that one man's trash is another man's treasure. So I would import yurts out of Mongolia that they were going to throw away and bring them into Los Angeles and sell them. I imported a container of yurts, which is basically tents that are old tents that have holes in them that they would just throw them away. I imported them into LA and I sold them for $40,000 a yurt. And I had bought them for $5, $6.
Wow.
Same thing, it's one man's trash is another man's treasure, only if they know what it's worth. Michael Burry knew that the trash of the housing system was coming, and so he bet that that's what would happen. There's other people, Pabrai does the same thing. He's invested in concrete companies in Turkey. Yeah. That's what the best investors in the world do. They have knowledge and they use that knowledge to place bets, and they put their money where their mouth is. And that's how you create forces. So yes, there are dark forces, but they're not dark as in terms of malevolent. They're just there. You have to understand the secondary effects of primary actions and then predict 2, 3, 4, 5 steps out to try to figure out what happens. I mean, do we really know what's going to happen with the US election? Can any one of us really say? I mean, and so you have to place bets in both directions.
Yeah.
And I can give you an approximation, but you have to cover your bets. And statistically, there's no black or white answers. There's only relative answers. There is nothing absolute in this world. There's only relative. And so it's in those niches of relativity that you make real resource decisions and you make real money.
Wow, doctor, that's really rich. From what you said, reminded me of a story I read somewhere. I do not know how true it is, but there was a story of two kids playing around with shiny rocks, two people walking, and then they asked the kids were actually basically throwing the rocks around. And then two people walk in and ask the kids, where do you guys find these rocks? So the kids led these people to where the rocks are, and the people started picking them in a bunch of pieces and bags and whatever they could to take them away. And the people were like, they're just rocks that kids play around with. Fast forward many years later, and this happened in the DR Congo in Africa. They found out those were diamonds. So 1 month's trash, the kids were playing with it. It's just, it's been here since our great grandparents resettled here, and it's really nothing. It's just rocks, and it's really shiny when the sun shines on it. They wash it, polish it, and it's diamond today, and it's really expensive. So you're really right. What you don't care about, someone cares about it and actually knows what to do with it, and that's how people will actually differentiate between somebody ended up becoming successful and someone becoming not successful because there's another saying, one of my favorites. I always mention Les Brown's name because he makes a lot of sense and he resonates with me. We all got 24 hours today. So it does make sense. Thank you. My very last question, like I promised, I just wanted to throw the ball back to you. What do you have anything else to say before we sign up? Advice, anything, just anything at all.
There's a bunch of stuff that I'd want to say, but I think that people need to be very consciously aware of what they consume. And I'm not talking about just food. I'm talking about information. I think that you have to question your consumption of information. You have to question the consumption of your food. You have to question the consumption of practically everything, because it drives how you believe and what you believe. So when I
Sure.
look at, and I think it's really relevant, because when I look at media and I ask myself, well, what does that media tell me? And do I believe it? Because there's a lot of misinformation about health. There's a lot of misinformation about wealth. There's a lot of misinformation just about everything, because they all have an agenda. And so if you consume and you do not judge the way that you're consuming, you're going to, your paradigm, how you view things changes, and it may change in a negative way. When I do consumption of information, I try to get and look at information that I probably disagree with. And so I usually look at more than 2 or 3 sources for my information, because I'll find out that mass media says this, some niche journal says this, and this other group that sponsors mass media says this. And so you want to really be that information that you're bringing into your body, into your brain, has to be judged, and you should question everything and ask yourself, what does that really mean? And is the person that's telling me this, what's their agenda? I think that if we had more of that questioning, I think that people would have a better long-term outcome. And I don't think we would be dealing with a crisis of obesity today. I don't think we would be dealing with a crisis of diabetes. I don't think that we'd be dealing with as much autism. I don't think that we would have as much depression. I don't think we would have as much drug addiction. I think all of these things would improve. And I think that we, as a population, would be doing a lot better. So I think we should question pieces of information that we're getting and look for multiple sources, and look for sources outside of what we traditionally look at. So I don't rely on CNN or Fox or one of these. I mean, I'm the kind of guy that will go out and look at Al Jazeera. I'll look at BBC. I'll look at Financial Times. I'll look at the Singapore Times. And then I'll go back and look at studies and try to understand what the studies mean. And it's always interesting to me when I map this out that each of these identified media sources has an agenda. And you can see it when you compare it against other media sources. I think it's really critical to look at.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So to back up with that, what you said, there could be one story that breaks, and 2 different media houses will report it out in a different way. And then you're sitting here like, okay, well, it's the same situation, same mishap or whatever that happened. Why are we hearing 2 different information from people that are supposed to just go in and tell exactly what they saw? And it changes, and it's interesting. So yeah, I do agree with what you just finally said. Do your own research, find your own way out. Especially in this modern day of information, it gets difficult. I do understand. Was it 2 days ago? A friend of mine wanted to buy something from Nike, and then he just goes into the browser and types Nike, and goes to the Nike website. He was at the checkout, and then he did say he realized something was not the same. So he hit me up and said, "Hey, can you send me the actual official Nike website?" And I went in there because I have the Nike app. I just copied the link from the Nike app and send it over, and it wasn't the Nike that he was about to check out. So it's everything around it. He took a screenshot, and everything around the site. It was so difficult to tell that it wasn't Nike website, Nike's official website. So information is now getting information and getting the right sources of information is now becoming harder and harder, but with a lot of, like you said, comparison, a lot of judgment, and a lot of thinking back and say, is this really actually correct that I think it is? Will go a long way to help out. You guys already know my name. It's Gideon. I do want to thank you again, Dr. Padda, for coming through.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love being on the show.
Thank you.